To begin, I'm going to hand over to the wonderful Sabrina Mahfouz. And first of all, just Sabrina, I'm just going to very quickly read the biog that I have for you, but I'm sure you can supplement that in any way that you deem fit. So Sabrina is coming today from, you just moved, haven't you? Where have you moved? It's to Hackney. She's come from Hackney. And she began by training as a civil servant after she did a master's in international diplomacy. But then she turned to writing poetry and prose. And her first piece for theatre, called That Boy, was performed at the Soho Theatre in 2010 and won a Westminster Prize for New Playwrights. Since then, she's been a celebrated poet, playwright and performer. And in 2012, Sabrina was nominated as a World Economic Forum Global Shaper by the World Economic Forum. And she is currently poet in residence for Cape Farewell. And we're absolutely honoured that she's written some work to perform today. Sabrina.
It's so funny when you hear bios. I'm sure there are people who are like, oh my God, what did I actually do that? Anyway, that was a long time ago. I'm very honoured to be here to open this day and totally unqualified to do so because I probably know the least about sustainable fashion in this whole room, but that's maybe why I'm the most excited about the day. I'm really excited. And I'm a poet in residence, as Kate said, with an organisation that the Sustainable Fashion, Centre for Sustainable Fashion works with occasionally, called Cape Farewell, which is an arts and climate change organisation. So they commission artists to take the facts, the science, and make it publicly palatable, I guess. And so I met Kate and Dilys and the team here and was really fascinated by the work that they do because when I started writing after I left the government, I tried to be a fashion journalist, quickly realised it wasn't that easy and that I should do poems instead because that's much easier. And but the love for fashion still remains and for me, like, fashion is poetry really because it's encapsulating a moment. It's documenting a time, it's immediate, but in the best cases it also lasts over a very, very long period. And it's transformative and it's fluid. And when I can't figure out how I feel, I write a poem, and when I do know how I feel, I reflect it in an outfit. Don't know how that means today, but anyway, sometimes I do. So in that case, I think maybe fashion is a more advanced art form than poetry, but don't tell the poets that I said that. So I'm just going to start today with a poem called Capture that I wrote having read the Local Wisdom Craft of Use website and all the wonderful stories that are on there, which if anyone hasn't checked it out, they should. Now that we are no longer young, I want to capture it all. The baked birthday cakes, balloons blown until there's no breath left to say the words you wrote on brightly dyed card instead. The arms bracketing insolence magnetised by youth, welcoming returns damaged with no tags. Days that weightlessly sprung around bubble-gummed lips, grass-stained hands, narrowed blades in moonless nails, scrubbed clean by you in plastic bowls of foamy fairy liquid. Those tears you picked from cups of tea and mixed with milk, swirled. I just want you to be happy, that's all you said. I want to capture it all, but I can't. There are no cameras capable of catapulting themselves, head first, backwards, past what they spy. Right now is all they can capture. So this is why I wear the denim jacket, jabbed with badge pins from places I no longer recall revisiting. This is why I sew a missing button onto the shirt that held your heart close. This is why I tie a scarf around my wrist that once gave kisses to foreheads when you bent down to say goodnight, my loves. Gloves whose worn fingertips I've ripped off so that what I can't prove existed exists now. Each patch of material that wrapped itself around you captures all that the hard metal of the camera never can. It's glass useless in the quest to really remember. And so I will use it, wear it, show it, for then the threads will pulse your name and I will carry your age. Thank you.
You know, I realised I also forgot to tell you where the loo was. Sorry, there was no, it's this way. This way and to the left, both male and female, sorry. Sabrina, thank you, that was amazing. So I'm going to kick off this day by telling you a little bit about the project that has spawned this event. And it's the case that for the last 5 years I've been exploring loads of ideas, grappling with questions that range from scarcity to satisfaction, to consumption, to ideas around agency, capabilities, thriving, all within a fashion context. And as part of that, what I've been doing is talking to the public, almost 500 members of the public around the world, about how they use their clothes, about the practices of use, the stories, the skills, the structures, the politics of what actually goes on beyond the point of purchase. And you know, there's loads of evidence that suggests that what happens beyond this point of purchase both contributes to environmental impact in a really big way, and it's also a source of huge satisfaction for people. But the other realization is that we don't really know much about what happens. And I would say that really, I haven't done this alone. There has been, particularly over the last 2 years, a huge team of people. We've had 7 partner universities in 3 continents working on this together. And they're all here today. We've got folk from New Zealand and Australia, Canada, the US, and Denmark. And I would just like to honour them all. Thank you. It's been a privilege. I also wish, however, to honour the amazing people that have shared their stories over the last 5 years. This is just, you know, the members of the public who are incredibly innovative in what they're doing, and really their ideas are the starting points of this real adventure that we've been on. And this was one of the first stories that emerged. This guy in his 80s came to the village I live in the north of England, and he turned up. He was too infirm to climb the stairs into the old mill that we were photographing in. So here he is standing at the bottom. And he came up with this, he described it as his 3-stage jacket. And what he'd done is it had been given to him, and then he'd put a few pounds on it. He could no longer fasten it at the front. So he took a pair of scissors and snipped it up the back, knitted a panel, which you can see. He nattily inserted it down the back, and then wore it like that for a few years. A few years later, he thought, oh, you know what I need to do? I need to put a collar, a waistband onto this, and some sleeves. And so on he did, and he added another layer to this jacket. And then about 10 years later, when he put on a few more pounds and could no longer fasten it, he created what he described as latchets, leather pieces across the front, so that he had this sort of open system. And he finished each one with a sequin. This woman, also in her 80s, came to a shoot in London. She's wearing a dress that she was given when she was in her 30s. It was by a neighbour. And she wore it when she went to Antibes on holiday. But the big news about this dress is that actually it is competitively worn by all the females in her family, by her 3 daughters and her granddaughters. And we have photographs of them all wearing the garment. What goes on beyond the point of purchase are things that perhaps we didn't quite realise. And you actually realise that garments, they're really influenced by these actions. And that in the hands of users, garments do many, many things. But the difficulty is that if you try to talk to people about using garments, it's really hard. There's very little language. There's no visual language, to be sure. And there's very little verbal language to describe what these skills are, what these practices are of using stuff. There's no really any descriptions for the everyday iterative use of clothes. And it's not about the guiding hand of a designer here. It's not about a brand, but it's about the multiple voices and actions of others. There's very little shared language for this. And yet, it's absolutely at the core of improving knowledge and understanding of the world. It's about an ethos of care. And what I think these 500 stories that we have from members of the public, what they show is a body of evidence that's pragmatic. You know, all those things that you can see, you can imagine doing them yourself. They're innovative in very small ways, granted, but they still have a spark of something that makes me think, oh, that's interesting. They're quite cultivated. And you know what? They're alive, which is something really, really exciting. And I think what we see is that while we're talking about use is very difficult, it's quite foreign for people engaged with fashion. What we realize is that sustainability is profoundly shaped by what goes on beyond the point of purchase. And we see that sustainability ideas in fashion, they're really not dictated by the intrinsic physical properties of garments, but actually by our social system. And what we see we're dealing with is a political, not a technical challenge. And that's quite hard to grapple with. So a tiny bit of context. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. So the urgent need to really engage with environmental, social and economic issues at a systemic level is both formally and globally recognised now. And in 2009, a report by Rockstrom et al., a huge team of climate scientists, produced a report, and this image, this visualisation was associated with it, which is now probably quite widely known and probably known to you. And what effectively they said that they identified 9 planetary boundaries, and 3 of those have already been transgressed. And this is incredibly serious. These 3 being the rate of human interference in nitrogen cycles, rate of biodiversity loss, climate change, and the others are very close to being transgressed. But each transgression, while serious in its own right, of course, because changes in Earth systems are non-linear, their potential effects are very dramatic. And they talk about collapse of bigger systems. And at the same time, this same report from Rockstrom and his colleagues had a message of hope and agency in it. It talked about there being a safe space, a safe operating space for humanity within these planetary boundaries. And that actually within that space, different sorts of initiatives, different sorts of approaches were not only possible, but essential. I think we probably all know in this room as well that fashion contributes to unsustainability in many different ways, spectacularly and devastatingly so. And I won't go into those now. And I would also say that many people in the room have done massive and very important things to reduce the negative effects of this. And this is vital, and that it continues is also essential. So I suppose starting in the 1990s, people began to really understand and recognize the impact that the fashion system was having on surrounding environments. And efficiencies were then pursued. People were looking for alternative fibers, new chemical processes, technical improvements through the supply chain, transparency, recycling, upcycling. You sort of know the drill. And I would say, although this is a bit of a feeling, perhaps I haven't got any quantitative data to back it up, but I would say that in this time over the last 20, 25 years, there has been a decline in impact per garment produced. I would say that we do see efficiency savings. Oh, sorry, it's the wrong one. And yet, there's also a very difficult moment. There's a sense of sort of horror, really, as we realize that the scale of consumption outweighs the positive effects of all of that hard work, because the volumes are increasing faster than the efficiencies can reduce the impact. So put simply, the attempts that we've made to lessen the impact of the fashion sector have been simply eroded by the number of garments in circulation. So our best intentions have really come up against the structures of unsustainability. And it's probably not news to anybody. And what's happened, of course, within the fashion system, like many other places, is that some very fundamental questions have really been left unexamined. People have skirted around the edge of really grappling with difficult things like consumption, about the cumulative effects of fashion behaviour, about the need for profound structural change, about how to think and act for the long term in the short term, and perhaps more critically about thinking of ideas of thriving for humans, for natural systems, and actually what role fashion has to play in that. For me, it's linked to some really difficult questions about responsibility, about care, about agency, about capabilities, about human actions, human relationships and the material effects of those. And I'm now appropriating a line that I heard elsewhere, but it's about an opportunity to improve the human condition, not just better display and express the human condition. We have this great opportunity to do something really different here. So how do we do that? Well, I reckon there's probably two ways that we have to go with this. The first is quite simply that we have to really be honest with ourselves and more fully acknowledge fashion's shared biography with consumption. We have to, suppose, develop knowledge that grounds us in the actual condition, that sees the influence of the market, of individualistic consumption on our ideas about fashion in order better to understand their influence on us. And then the second thing that I think we have to do is we have to stray outside of that understanding. We have to reappreciate fashion and its potential to nourish and foster very different actions. And we have to speak about many of the things that are linked to fashion, but that don't just contribute to growth. And that's a very difficult thing to talk about. These are all things I know you also know already, but the consumer society is so dominant in our culture that we don't really notice it. And it's really normal to engage with fashion largely through shopping for new stuff. So fashion is very much cut in the cloth of consumerism. Consumption is a search for satisfaction, and material culture is important, but the scale of what's going on is extremely damaging. And in that time, cheap garments have really changed consumption patterns. In the first decades of the 21st century, clothing prices fell by over 25% in the UK, and in the US it was about 17%. And in that time, of course, volumes are increasing. So people are spending roughly the same amount on clothes, but the volume they have is massively more now. We're also seeing how long products last and of obsolescence being a really key tool used by the fashion system to increase and elevate consumption. Instant rewards are ever cheaper and easier to access. And we're now faced with a hierarchy of fashion provision which displaces other experiences of what fashion can be. Everyone's real major experience of what fashion is just simply through shopping for new stuff. And what has seemingly happened is that ideas, even sustainability ideas, are framed within fashion's own terms. So it's always a new product to buy. It's always an additional route to more consumption. And that this happens for sustainability as well is a very difficult lesson for us all to learn. I suppose as a key question is, why are everything, even the sustainability initiatives that are generated, so obsessed, so fixated on the present? And why is the object out of context always the priority? But anyway, what ends up happening is that a very narrow spectrum of what fashion is seemingly valued by all of these systems. And what we demand going forward is influenced by our experience of what fashion was in the past. And our world is sort of dominated by commodity products, by a sense of that we're individuals, autonomous, and other experiences of what fashion is are just marginalised, sent to the sidelines. It does this other thing as well, which is for me extremely limiting, is that other things, other expressions of fashion are sort of squeezed out. They're repressed. They appear impossible because the cultural conditions that we have create desire, not for these alternatives, but for the current setup. So everything else seems expensive, undesirable, impractical. And what we have is consumerist fashion promotes a view that fashion is about isolated individuals, not really in a social community, about consumers, not users, about objects, not agents, and so on and so forth. And yet, what I would say to you, that all of these images that I've been showing you are for me huge, huge evidence to suggest that actually fashion is not this. It's also something else. It's not only a consumer experience. It's actually a shared enterprise. This woman in California came along with this dress that she felt was a bit short, and so she'd added another fabulous little tier to the bottom of it and then pinned a top in, feeling the power and the potential to change things. This guy in London saw that keeping a garment for quite a long time was a political statement, a way to begin to influence what brands do, subverting what brands do. What we see with all of this is that fashion can and should acknowledge the contribution of others. It's dependent on it. I suppose it's a way of thinking and working from the ground up. Consumerism has sort of built a vision of the world where all people are islands. The assumption that we're somehow separate from our place, from our island, and our lives are individualized, autonomous. But our fate lies in the world. And it's in a world that's immediate, it's connected, it's multiple, and it's incredibly powerful. And this, I would say, is our future. So this view of fashion has no fixed start point or end point, really. It has an extended view of responsibility. There's something here where you see a very broad spectrum of values that reflect life as we see it, as we experience it on a day-to-day basis, far more fully. But these things aren't currently reflected in the fashion system that we have, where we transform things far beyond just the stitching of a seam or the selection of fabric, where we see design as a provisional framework that still must be filled in a relationship with the people who use this stuff. And where we actually take into account this knowledge of what users do alongside industrial knowledge to remain relevant, and to more than that, to help people thrive. What you sort of see when you talk to people is that this is the other part of design. Use forms the other part of what goes on in the sort of design relationship. And this is how the parts are all working together. This is about synthesis. And it's remarkably powerful when you talk to folk and discover that these things are the things that we've been creating. They add up to something different. But fundamentally, even thinking about users, thinking about what happens beyond the point of purchase is very, very difficult. It's a very different business than the one that we're used to. And it's partly perhaps because actually dealing with people, negotiating with people and the future over time is really quite expensive. It's difficult to do. It's nuanced. Our systems don't have that sort of approach or flexibility. And we also see, and this is a huge, huge challenge, is actually, it's really frightening working in this space. There is no sort of safety net. When you challenge the status quo in this way, when you ask people to take a leap from the certainty of controllable things to this crazy world of users where literally anything does happen, becomes a very challenging, endlessly raveling and unraveling set of relationships over time. It's a very difficult, uncomfortable place to be. So there's this other difficulty that is ongoing, is that garments are really designed as static objects, but actually they're not static at all, because once they enter our lives, they're matter in motion. They're kinetic, they're dynamic, they're emergent, they have living qualities. And you see that the users, the people, all these folk that we're seeing, they're imperfect, they're multiple, they're political often, and you know, they're all the better for it, and that needs to be embraced. This is my dad in the 1960s, actually, wearing a jumper that he still wears today. What you see is that garments are sold to us as products, but when they enter our lives, they become part of a rich and emerging process. And designing with and for that, and recognizing that this space of lives is where sustainability can emerge, is a very powerful place to begin. What you see is that in these clothes, this is where life happens. This is where sustainability happens. So the ambition is to enter the life world of the user, to climb into the deep inner space of the wardrobe, to engage with time, and to also get down and dirty with the very, very messy stuff that you do on an everyday basis. This guy had never sewn anything before, but he thought he was a dancer, and he really liked having his knees free because there was loads of flexibility, so he only sewed up the top section. So what you begin to see is that design knowledge becomes situated knowledge. It's placed in the world. It's a place where perhaps public good can meet private interest, use meets industry. You recognize the conditions that are there, and then we work with them. So I suppose what thinking about use is a shift in the way we think about garments. It's about thinking about garments and fashion as the use of garments through time. And suddenly you have a very different view of what a garment is if you're trying to contend with people and also the passing of time in that. And we get a very, very different picture of the resources that we have. It's about skills, it's about materials, and these are widely dispersed, widely spread around. So we've been calling this the craft of use. These skills, these cultivated ways of doing things that share many commonalities with the craft of production. But these don't happen in a way in the production sense, but these happen in everybody's lives. Because what we realize is that we need to put as much emphasis on using and tending as on creating things. And if we gave design attention to that, industrial attention to that, who knows where that would lead. And it's absolutely not an abandoning of fashion and design intelligence. On the contrary, it's exercising it in a broader field, a field that encounters real lives, that engages with sustainability. It also does this other thing, which for me is really, really important, which is it acknowledges the values and actions of things that the market really doesn't value. It sees potential and aliveness elsewhere. So what we see very carefully, very clearly even, is that using things, these skills, these behaviours, stories, this stuff around use, which isn't really talked about, it's actually not a reductionist speciality. It doesn't fit within the way things happen at the moment. It's all about patterns. It's about connection. It's not about separation. It's about decentralization, not centralization. It's about synthesis. And it's a counterweight to the very persistent, narrow views of fashion that we see that fit within a consumerist system. It's a real counterweight to that. And it's another view of what sustainability is and might be. It's a process also of learning. of education, of development over time. And it's this thing also. It's what I would describe as a commitment strategy. This afternoon, Avner Offer is going to come from Oxford to talk a little bit about some of his ideas around pacing consumption and affluence, and also about commitment strategies. But he describes how many of the challenges that we face are stuck within us needing to strike a balance between the needs of the present and the long-term security of the future. It's that sense of striking that balance. And some of the things that do that, he describes as commitment strategies. In the past, there were things like prudence, self-control, other mechanisms that now are very sound, very old-fashioned anyway, but that helped us perhaps regulate the amount that we're consuming now because we knew that the security of the future depended on it. And all of these things like prudence are now outmoded. They sort of have lost their power to influence the very, very voracious appetites of the market. But I would contest that using things well, thinking about use as a way of going forward, is a way to help us commit to the future better, because you're thinking about things in a different way. It's also about attentiveness. It's about, I suppose, extending the web of noticing so that you see things much more, that you recognize what things are and you appreciate them. And I think that that also is a really fundamental component. There's a huge raft of issues to do with agency, the ability of individuals to act independently of the way that society is organized, to think differently. Because when people use things, they tend to have a sense of the practical deployment of what they're doing. They get involved in mutual enterprise and they become sort of expert citizens. It's also about capabilities. It's a self-reliance of a certain kind, being master of your own stuff. And it requires an intelligibility of our possessions and sort of mastering it so that you can be responsible for it. So what we see is that when we think about use, we end up thinking about practical skills, patterns of thought, stories, habits of mind, structures, objects themselves, the ability to act. All of these things create, through repertoires of gestures, of hands, of tools, of some of the tools next door, for example, an iterative process of use. What they create is they create a potential for engaging with sustainability in a way that can and will, I'm sure, reduce resource use massively. It opens up a space where we can think about ways to develop our fashion experiences qualitatively without necessarily increasing the amount that we consume. So the Nobel Prize winning economist Amartya Sen said something that I'm about to paraphrase, so if I've got it horribly wrong, apologies, but he said something along the lines of it, just because you own it doesn't mean you know how to use it. And if you can begin to understand the power to create use as a way to begin to take ownership and responsibility for the whole web of interrelated things around our world, perhaps our relationships and the future, then I think there is a really strong starting point. So on this project, I've shown you loads of images. Most of them, to begin with, were from the public. Then they were showing you some of the design work that's been a response to the things that we've seen. And now we're seeing some different images that you will also see next door, which Alex will talk about a little later. But what they represent are starting points about thinking about a visual language and an object-based material language for garments that think about use as an embodied activity. What I would also say is that use practices a real balance of present and future. We have the opportunity here to think through time and to use fashion in a very different way, to use it as a commitment strategy, and to graduate from a relationship that we have with fashion, where it's locked in a binary relationship between production and consumption. And when we think about sustainability, we generally only think about tweaking production or consumption. But actually, we have this other opportunity to step outside of that and to think about use as a way to reframe views on what we're doing, where views of fashion include, but are not only limited to, the confines of what can be turned into a frock and traded. It does include industry, absolutely, but it includes other things too. And a wealth of other things are included. So the informal economy helps us pixelate the view. Currently we have a view of the fashion economy that's sort of a one thing, it's a one blob, a bit of an amorphous mess. But use and the ideas that are based on it, the multiple stories that you see that people are doing with things, help us pixelate that, almost so that we can then be responsible for it much more, so that we understand it much more. So many of the things that you will see on the stories next door, and if you visit the Local Wisdom website, all the 500 stories there, you will see that none of them, I would say, are earth-shattering. But cumulatively, they are incredibly powerful. They're widely distributed. They already exist. And so I think what they do is they offer us a view of sustainability that is different to the one that's promoted so far, that's extended, that's holistic, and also that's linking ideas in different ways. So sustainability is an outcome of the way that we live our lives. And if we're going to engage with sustainability, therefore lives are a great starting point. And identifying these lives, we have to embrace them, not retreat from them because they're difficult, messy, complex. And to do so is both pragmatic and it's also profound. It's a really different change. To do so also takes courage, it takes patience, it takes tenacity, because it requires a very different way of looking at the issues. It puts what we do in a completely different context, and it gives us lots of practical, achievable starting points, but it also speaks to this very big agenda where we see fashion as a broad spectrum of activity, where we see it as alive within our world, and we see it as contributing to sustainability in a way that perhaps has not really been thought about to date. And so, what we're going to do after Jonathan Porritt speaks is we're going to begin to think about what use of stuff, use of clothes specifically, might be like in practice. We're going to do various workshops where we're going to begin to think about that, and we're going to bridge from perhaps some of the framing, the ideas, to a very much more of a practical way. We have a huge and amazing group of facilitators who are going to be helping do that. And I would just like to say in advance, thank you to you all for engaging with these things. I don't know whether the timing is right. I've completely just... Okay. With further ado, I'll say thank you.
Them into shorts, and since then they've been kind of ripping themselves. I go dancing in them or adventures or get up to mischief or whatnot, you know. So every time I go out I have to spend 5 to 10 minutes restapling, closing holes with rubber bands, paper clips and things. This side is kind of a mess, big knots and things. So every time it's a new pair of shorts, almost when I leave the house. They rip on their own. And then I kind of react to whatever's happened to them when I get home. Or I'll even bring a handful of paper clips when I go out, just in case I need to make some repairs on the go, because you can't show off too much skin.